Hi everyone. In the last class, we discussed about nutrition in the organisms. We learned how the complex food is broken down into a simpler form in our digestive system, and the villi present in the small intestine absorb the digested food, and they are also richly supplied with the blood vessels, which takes the absorbed food to each and every cell of the body. Do you know what happens to the digested food in the cell? Yes, the digested food, that is nothing but the glucose get converted into energy. The process by which living beings converts the food into energy is known as respiration. So in this class, let us learn about respiration and respiration, how the respiration takes place in the human beings. So what is respiration? The respiration is nothing but the process. It's a process by which living beings utilize the food. They'll make use of the food to get converted into energy. That is known as respiration. Respiration is one of a type of chemical reaction. We can call it as an oxidation reaction, in which carbohydrates, that is nothing but the glucose, the digested food, what we call it as, is oxidized. It get oxidized to produce the energy. Where does this oxidation and all take place? As you know that it takes place in a cell. In the cell, there is a mitochondria. Mitochondria is a site of respiration. We can also call it as a powerhouse of the cell. Why do we call it as a powerhouse of the cell? Because in that site, in that mitochondria, the food gets converted into energy. And not only that, the extra energy, what is released, it also will be stored in the form of the ATP. ATP is nothing but adenosine triphosphate. Whenever it is needed, as per as needed, when you do more of work and all, you have to utilize more of energy, isn't it? During that particular time, this ATP will get converted into energy, and you can ATP is stored in the mitochondria and it is released as per as needed. So whenever it is required, you can make use of that, the stored ATP, that is nothing but adenosine triphosphate. Now, how does this energy is released in the cell? We'll just see. As soon as the glucose reaches the cell, what happens there? There will be a cell membrane which allows the glucose inside the cell. So as soon as the glucose get inside the cell, there will be a cytoplasm. It reaches the cytoplasm, and you should be knowing that glucose is nothing but 6 carbon molecule. It contains 6 carbon molecules, C6H12O6, correct? 6 carbon atom is present in the glucose. So as soon as it enters the cytoplasm, the glucose get converted into pyruvate. That is nothing but 6 carbon molecule will get converted into 3 carbon molecules. Then what happened is, in some of the organisms such as yeast and all, in the absence of oxygen itself, the releasing of energy takes place. So in the yeast, what happens? This pyruvate gets converted into ethanol, carbon dioxide and energy. So this happens in the absence of the oxygen. Whereas in our muscle cells, what happens in our muscle cell is, so here this pyruvate, so first the glucose enters to the cytoplasm. In the cytoplasm, it gets converted into pyruvate, and that pyruvate gets converted into lactic acid and energy in our muscle cell during the lack of oxygen. Usually when we do some exercise, we need more of energy. When you run fast, we need more of energy. Then even you will get a pain in your leg muscles. Why? Because of the respiration which takes place in our muscle cell. In the muscle cell, in the lack of oxygen, the pyruvate gets converted into lactic acid and the energy. So that's the reason we get pain, because of the presence of the lactic acid in the muscle cells. So once you take rest, the pain will get reduced sometimes after taking the rest. So this is what happens in our muscle cell. Whereas in the presence of oxygen, that is when this pyruvate from the cytoplasm, it enters to the mitochondria. In the mitochondria, in the presence of the oxygen, the glucose gets converted into carbon dioxide, water and the energy. This is how the glucose gets converted into energy. I'll repeat again. As soon as the glucose enter into the cell, that is in the cytoplasm, the glucose gets converted into pyruvate. In the yeast, what happens in the absence of the oxygen itself, this pyruvate gets converted into ethanol, carbon dioxide and energy. Whereas in a muscle cell, this pyruvate, in the lack of oxygen, it gets converted into lactic acid and the energy. Whereas in the mitochondria, so from the cytoplasm, this pyruvate enters to the mitochondria, and then in the presence of the oxygen, it gets converted into carbon dioxide, water and the energy. Based on whether the conversion of the glucose into energy takes place in the presence of oxygen or absence of oxygen, we can classify the respiration into two types, that is aerobic respiration and the anaerobic respiration. So what is aerobic respiration? It's a type of respiration where they make use of oxygen for converting the food into energy, that is breaking the glucose into energy. If it takes place in the presence of the oxygen, we call it as a aerobic respiration. If the conversion of the glucose into energy, if it takes place in the absence of the oxygen, then we call it as a anaerobic respiration. So here, based on the whether the oxygen is present or the oxygen is absent, we can classify the respiration into two types, aerobic and anaerobic respiration. We'll see the difference between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Here you can observe over here. In the first case, what happened in the yeast cell is the glucose has been converted into energy in the absence of the oxygen. So I can call this type of respiration as a anaerobic respiration. Even in our muscle cell also, there is a lack of oxygen. The glucose has been converted into energy. See, the first glucose get converted into pyruvate in all the three cases, that too in the cytoplasm. Whereas in the absence of oxygen in the yeast, the pyruvate gets converted into ethanol, carbon dioxide and energy. Whereas in a muscle cell, the pyruvate, in the lack of oxygen, it's got converted into lactic acid and the energy. In this both the cases, the glucose has been converted into energy. Only thing is, in the absence of the oxygen, they have not make use of the oxygen for the converting the glucose into energy. So we can call this type of respiration as a anaerobic respiration. Whereas in the third case, when you just observe the third case, here the glucose has been converted into pyruvate in the cytoplasm, then again it enters to the mitochondria, where it is mitochondria is called as powerhouse of the cell. In that mitochondria, in the presence of the oxygen, the glucose gets converted into carbon dioxide, water and the energy. In this case, the respiration has taken place in the presence of the oxygen. That is why we can call it as a aerobic respiration. So what are the difference between aerobic and anaerobic respiration? Aerobic respiration takes place in the presence of the oxygen. Anaerobic respiration takes place in the absence of the oxygen. Then the aerobic respiration takes place in both cytoplasm and the mitochondria, whereas anaerobic respiration takes place in the cytoplasm itself. And what is the end product of the aerobic respiration? Carbon dioxide, water and the energy. Whereas in an anaerobic respiration, in the case of the yeast, what is obtained is nothing but the ethanol, carbon dioxide and the energy are the end product, whereas in a muscle cell, lactic acid and the energy is the end product. And when you just observe here, during the aerobic respiration, if the glucose is broken down into energy in the presence of the oxygen, lot of energy will be released compared to the anaerobic respiration. In anaerobic respiration, less amount of energy will be released. So this is a difference between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Very important. Aerobic respiration takes place in the presence of the oxygen, whereas anaerobic respiration takes place in the absence of the oxygen. And remember, the end product of aerobic respiration is carbon dioxide and water, whereas end product of anaerobic respiration is lactic acid or carbon dioxide, alcohol. And the aerobic respiration takes longer time to release energy, whereas anaerobic respiration, it is fast process as compared to the aerobic respiration. And a lot of energy will be released during the aerobic respiration, whereas small amount of energy will be released during the anaerobic respiration. So example of the aerobic respiration, it occurs in most of the plants and the animals, whereas anaerobic respiration takes place in yeast, bacteria, human muscle cells, etc. So this is about the two types of respiration. So now we got to know that how the glucose gets converted into energy, and that energy will be using for doing many activities. But just now we got to know that oxygen is necessary for the respiration, that is aerobic respiration. Then how do the cell get oxygen? So you might have observed that when you stand in the front of the mirror and when you inhale and exhale, you can just see the movement of the chest cavity. So what is this? What is this actually? We have a nose, wherein we use that nose for the exchange of the gases. That is, it helps in taking in oxygen and giving out the carbon dioxide. What is this process called as? It is called as breathing. Breathing, it's one of the physical process involving the exchange of the oxygen and the carbon dioxide. During this process, energy will not be released. Only thing is oxygen is taken in and carbon dioxide is given out. Why we have to take in oxygen? For the conversion of the food into energy, right? And this taking in oxygen and carbon dioxide takes place outside the cell. Here the cell will not be involved in this process, whereas, and even some of the enzymes to break glucose into energy, also enzymes will not at all involve. Whereas the respiration is a biochemical process where the food is oxidized, that is glucose is oxidized to carbon dioxide and water. Here the release of energy takes place. And this respiration, where does it takes place? It takes place in the cell. Of course, respiratory enzymes are involved. Now you got to know the difference between the breathing and the respiration. Breathing helps in respiration. How does they helps in respiration? They helps in supplying the oxygen towards the cell. Correct? Here, what type of respiration takes place in our cell? It is nothing but the aerobic respiration. So now we got to know the difference between the breathing and the respiration. So now what we have to do is we have to take in oxygen through the nose and we have to pass that oxygen towards the cell for the respiration process, that is conversion of the glucose into energy. Already our digestive system has passed the digested food to the cell. Now the food has to get converted into energy. To convert the food into energy, our cell need the oxygen. So the supply of oxygen is very much necessary. For that, the breathing is very essential. So now what does our human respiratory system consist of? Now let us learn about the human respiratory system. How does the oxygen from the atmosphere? So as we know that we are human beings, and human beings have got the lungs which helps in the respiration. So now let us learn how the oxygen which is present in the atmosphere passes through the nose and how it will pass to the cell. So for that, we have to learn about the human respiratory system. So we breathe in and breathe out with the help of the respiratory system. So when we breathe in and breathe out with the help of a respiratory system, we should know more about our respiratory system. What does our respiratory system consist of? Our respiratory system consists of nose and some of the air passages. Air passages means whatever the air is intaken through the nose, it has to pass to the different part of a respiratory system. So those we call it as a air passages. So here, as soon as the air enters to the nose, it reaches the pharynx. Then after the pharynx, it reaches the trachea. Trachea is also called as a windpipe. Then from the trachea is divided into bronchus, and each bronchus enter to the lungs, right lungs and the left lungs. And then again the bronchus is subdivided into bronchioles. Then at the end of the bronchioles, you have got a alveoli or the air sacs. Now let us learn one by one like how the respiration takes place in the human beings. So now first and foremost is a nose. So as you know that the nose is a pyramid shape. You can just observe the shape of the nose. It is a like a pyramid, and it has got a cavity. We call that cavity as a nasal cavity, and there are two nasal passage, as you know that. So the nasal passages are covered by a moist mucous membrane, and it also has got a fine hairs. Okay, now we'll see what happens when the hair enters. When the air enters, it will, the mucus which is present over here, it will make the moist, and it makes moist and warms to protect the lungs from the harmful effect of the dry air, and it will warm the air also. It will make moist as well as it will warm the air, so that your lungs will not be affected. Then the fine hairs which are present, it filters the dust particle present in the hair. That is the work of the nose. So the nostril has got the nose has got a nasal cavity. That nasal cavity contains the mucous membrane as well as the air. It will filter the dust particle and it warms the air, and then it will pass on to the next part, that is nothing but the windpipe. So windpipe or a trachea. When you just observe the windpipe or a trachea, then you can just see a tube-like structure. The first, as soon as the air enters, it reaches the larynx, and then from the larynx it comes to the trachea. The trachea, when you observe the trachea contains the C-shaped cartilage which protects the trachea, and this trachea helps in passing the air. It filters the air and warms up and moistens the incoming air. So that is the work of the trachea. Here, the trachea is also called as the windpipe. The trachea is also called as a windpipe. It is a flexible tube which runs from the larynx. Then, after it runs from the larynx, you can just observe here, the trachea is covered by the C-shaped cartilage, which protects the trachea. It will not allow the trachea to collapse. And what is the function of this trachea? It helps in passing the filter. It will filter the air, it warms the air, it moistens the incoming air. Then this trachea is subdivided into the two branches, and each one is passing through the lungs. This is the lungs, and we call this as see, the next part is nothing but the bronchus. We call it as a bronchus. Now we'll see what happens, what's the function of the bronchi and the bronchiole. The main function of the bronchi is nothing but it will help in carrying the air from the trachea inside the lungs. See how it is entering to the lungs, and again this bronchi is subdivided into a bronchioles. It gets subdivided into bronchioles and it will carry the air into the bronchioles. Now in the bronchioles, at the terminal of the bronchioles, you can just observe the air sacs or a alveoli. We call it as a air sacs or a alveoli, and you can just observe that how this air sacs or an alveoli is surrounded by the blood vessels. They are all surrounded by the blood vessels. When you just observe the air sacs are surrounded by the blood vessels. What is the function of this air sacs or alveoli? Is nothing but it helps in exchange of the gases. How does it helps in exchange of the gases? See now, what happens is, as soon as the air enters through the nose, it will reach the larynx. From the larynx to the windpipe, that is trachea. Then the trachea is divided into bronchi. Each bronchi enter to the lungs, and the air also passes through the bronchi. Then it comes to the bronchioles. At the terminal of the bronchioles, they have got a air sacs. Now the oxygen has entered inside the lungs. Now, as soon as the oxygen reaches the air sac, that is nothing but the alveoli, exchange of the gases takes place. So what happened over there? As soon as the air enters to the alveoli, so here you can just observe the alveoli is supplied with the blood vessels, correct? Okay, now air sacs present in the terminal of the bronchioles, they are called as alveoli, that helps in the exchange of the gases. So the blood circulating around the alveoli gives the carbon dioxide and it will collect the oxygen which is present in the alveoli. So this exchange of the gases takes place in the alveoli. Now the oxygenated blood, it goes to the cell, and in the cell the oxygen helps in oxidizing the food, that is nothing but conversion of the glucose into the energy. So now we'll see the mechanism of the breathing, how the respiration mechanism takes place in the human beings. The mechanism of respiration in man take place in the two phases. One is inspiration, other one is expiration. During inspiration, what happens? See here, inspiration is nothing but inhale. Expiration is nothing but exhaling the air, giving out of the carbon dioxide. During inspiration, we take in oxygen. During the expiration, what we do is we'll give out the carbon dioxide. During inspiration, the muscle of the diaphragm, you can see over here, this is the muscle of the diaphragm. The diaphragm is it's a layer which divide the thoracic cavity into an abdomen cavity. This diaphragm play a very important role during the respiration. So here, during inspiration, what happens when you're taking in oxygen, what happens? The muscles of the diaphragm get contract and the diaphragm moves down. As soon as the muscle get contract, the diaphragm will move down. Once it moves down, what happens? There will be increase in the volume of a chest cavity. You can just see how the increase in the volume of the chest cavity compared to this. Once there is an increase in the volume of the chest cavity, the air pressure inside the chest cavity will decrease. So when the air pressure decreases, the oxygenated air present in the outside will have a high pressure. Always the air moves from an high pressure to the lower pressure, isn't it? So now the pressure is more outside, whereas the pressure is less inside. So during that, what happens? The air from the higher pressure, it moves to the low pressure area. So this is how the air enters inside the lungs. So I'll repeat, the air pressure inside the chest cavity decreases. The oxygenated air present outside the body, being at a high pressure, flows rapidly into the lungs. In the lungs, oxygenated air reaches the alveoli. Alveoli is surrounded by the blood capillaries. It gives the oxygen. It passes the oxygen to the blood capillaries and takes the carbon dioxide. Now, once the carbon dioxide is present in the alveoli, what happens over there? Expiration has to take place. That is exhaling the air from the lungs. It has to be thrown out. So during the expiration, what happens? The muscle of the diaphragm get relaxed and it will move upward. Whereas here it has moved downward. Whereas in the this process, it will move upward. So once it moves upward, what happens? The decrease in the volume of the chest cavity. So there will be decrease in the volume of the chest cavity and air pressure inside the chest is increased, whereas outside it will be decreased. Then what happened? The air, this helps in pushing out the carbon dioxide outside the body. This is how the mechanism of respiration takes place. I'll repeat, the mechanism of respiration in man takes place in two phases, that is inspiration and other one is expiration. So as you know that, what is inspiration? Inspiration is nothing but taking in air, whereas expiration is nothing but the giving out air. During the inspiration, the muscle of the diaphragm get contract and it will move down. As a result, the volume of the chest cavity increases, the air pressure decreases inside the chest cavity, whereas outside it will be more, so the air enters. Whereas in this case, that is in inhalation, what we call it as. So during that time, what happened is nothing but your inhale of air from the exhaling of the air from the lungs has to take place. During that time, the muscles of the diaphragm relax, diaphragm moves upward, then result in decrease in the volume of the chest cavity. The air pressure inside the chest cavity increases and pushes the carbon dioxide outside the body. This is how the respiration takes place in the man. today in today's class we learned about the respiration, how the respiration takes place in the human beings. In the next class, let us learn about the excretion. Thank you.